All right, so again, 4 main topics for the first unit of this course. In the introduction, we looked at 2 of the main topics that Schaefer-Landau discusses. Again, this would be the introduction to the fundamentals of ethics. The 2 main topics from the introduction were the issue of morality and knowledge, objectivism versus subjectivism about moral knowledge. Basics of logic was the other topic from the introduction. And then we're talking now about a theory of value. We've been talking about hedonism, one theory about what is the good. That is to say, what is the source of all value? What is it that makes all particular good things good? And one plausible answer to that question is that everything that is good because in one way or another it tends to promote pleasure or happiness. So as we've seen, that is the hedonist thesis. That is the thesis of this theory of value, and we talked last time about the theory in a general way. We also made some preliminary distinctions that you need to understand when you're talking about values, such as the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental values. And we took a look at the ideas of Epicurus in some detail, and we talked a little bit about the ideas of John Stuart Mill as well. For our next reading selection, we have a selection from John Stuart Mill, and we're going to look at his ideas in a little bit more depth now. And then, so just to finish my recap from a moment ago, the third main topic for this first unit of the course is hedonism as a theory of value, and then next time we'll take a look at criticisms of hedonism, critique of hedonism. Take a look at another primary source. For today's reading, we have a primary source from John Stuart Mill. And next time we'll take a look at another primary source. The primary sources are in our other text, The Ethical Life. Next time we'll take a look at a selection from Robert Nozick's criticisms of hedonism as a theory of value. But let's keep going now for a moment on what there is to say on behalf of hedonism as a theory of value and talk about John Stuart Mill's ideas in a little bit more depth. So in our selections, Mill writes that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, by unhappiness pain and the privation of pleasure. Okay, so I said last time that there are 2 fundamental questions to ethics. What is good? In the sense of this philosophical question, what is the good? And what is right? That is to say, what is the right thing to do? That is to say, as a matter of principle, what is the right thing to do? Not what is the right thing to do in each particular case, but can we identify some fundamental moral principle on the basis of which we could make those particular moral judgments? And so far in this first unit of the course, we've just been focusing on the question of what is good. We've been focusing on value theory and one theory about the nature of the good, hedonism. But you notice that in this selection that we have, Mill starts off talking about right action. What is it that makes right actions right? Now, that's going to be the main topic of the next unit of the course. That's going to be the main topic of the second unit of the course. We'll take a look at a couple of different theories about that. We'll take a look at a couple of different, what are sometimes called normative theories. That is to say, theories about right action. That's not our focus right now, but it's worth touching on this point that Mill starts off this discussion of hedonism as a theory of value by mentioning that what makes right actions right is their connection to happiness. That is to say, they tend to promote happiness, or they tend to minimize unhappiness or reduce unhappiness. So what we see here is that, and we'll see this going forward in the class, there's a close connection between these 2 questions, isn't there? What you believe is good is going to influence your judgments about what is right. So of course, they are different questions. What is the source of all value? What is the good? That's a value question. what in general is the right way to act, or as a matter of principle, how ought one to act, that's a normative question, a question about right action. But of course, the two questions are closely connected. If you believe, as Mill does, that happiness is the source of all value, happiness is the good, then you will be inclined to believe, as Mill also did believe, that what makes right actions right is that they tend to produce happiness. So of course there's a close connection between the concept of the right and the concept of the good. And again, right now we're focusing on the question of the good. But it's worth noting that connection before we move forward. So actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So if an act produces unhappiness or pain, then it's wrong. If an act tends to promote pleasure or happiness, then it's right. And we'll have to say more about that, and we will in the next unit of the course. But as we know, for hedonism, pleasure/happiness is the source of all value. So the only thing that is intrinsically good is pleasure/happiness. The only thing that is intrinsically bad would be pain/unhappiness. Mill writes that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. And all desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. So we talked last time about the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental values, and that's what Mill is saying here. There are two ways that things can be good. They are good either for the pleasure inherent in themselves. So we used this term last time, intrinsic. Inherent, same idea, just in itself, not for the sake of anything else. Pleasure/happiness is something that we just want for itself, not as a means to anything else. I went through this line of questioning last time. Why are you in this class? Well, I want the credits. Well, why do you want the credits? Well, I want the degree. Well, why do you want the degree? I want the good job. Why do you want the good job? I want the good salary. Why do you want the good salary? I want the things that I can get with it, a nice home and so forth. Why do you want that? Because it will make me happy. Well, if I ask you, why do you want to be happy? Again, there's no explanation that you can really give, is there? Certainly no explanation of the form, well, I want X for the sake of Y. I just gave a lot of examples where you want X for the sake of Y. I want the credits, I want the class for the credits, I want the credits for the degree, I want the degree for the job, I want the job for the salary. Those are all examples of I want X for the sake of Y. But if I were then to ask you, why do you want to be happy? What can you say? There's really no explanation that you can give, is there? You just do want it. We just do want it. We just do want to be happy. We don't want it for the sake of anything else. We just want it, as Mill says here, for the value inherent in itself. We just want pleasure. We just want things for the pleasure inherent in themselves. That is to say, just because they are pleasure, and that alone suffices to explain why we want something, according to Mill. Simply that it tends to promote happiness or pleasure. No further explanation is possible. Here again, we saw last time Schaefer-Landau talk about this idea of the limits of explanation. When it comes to explaining your action, you can't explain your action in terms of I did X for the sake of Y. You can't give that form of explanation forever. At some point you have to run up against a limit. Because it's an old observation in philosophy, going back at least as far as Aristotle, that there has to be some concrete reason for which you act. There can't be an infinite regress of reasons. Why did you do X? Well, I did X for the sake of Y. Why did you do Y? Well, I did Y for the sake of Z. That form of explanation can't go on forever, because if it did, then you would never actually get to a reason for why you acted. So there has to be some limit when it comes to explaining our actions. And hedonists believe, as we saw, Epicurus believed, as we see, Mill believes, that it's always at that end of the line, when you run up against that limit, when it comes to explaining why we act. it's always in one way or another connected to pleasure or happiness. At least that would be the hedonist thesis, as we've seen. It's either connected to happiness in the sense of, I wanted X for the pleasure inherent in itself, or I wanted X because it's an instrument to pleasure, it's an instrument to happiness, an instrumental kind of value. One of those two explanations is always the explanation. So always we ultimately act for the sake of pleasure or happiness, or for the sake of avoiding pain or unhappiness, which comes to the same thing, really. So as we've seen, that is the hedonist theory of value. So for Mill, the only intrinsic value is pleasure or happiness. The only intrinsic disvalue, that is to say, the only thing that is intrinsically bad, is pain, or that is to say, unhappiness. Again, I'm using the terms interchangeably. Pleasure, pain, they have somewhat narrower connotations, don't they? Pleasure, pain, we tend to think of these terms in physical terms. Happiness, unhappiness, these are broader terms, aren't they? But as we've seen, Epicurus, Mill, they believe in intellectual pleasures as well, pleasures of the mind. So as they use the term, it doesn't mean only something physical. Or as they would use the term pain, it doesn't mean only something physical. It could be psychological pain, unhappiness. So that's why I say, for our purposes, we can really use these terms interchangeably. They come to the same thing when it comes to Mill's ideas and Epicurus's ideas. So as we've seen, something has instrumental value only insofar as, and to the degree that, it results in pleasure. So pleasure / happiness is the source of all value. As we've said, that is the hedonist thesis. So we talked last time about this criticism of hedonism that's always been around. It's an old criticism. And Mill, in terms of modern philosophers, this 19th century British philosopher, John Stuart Mill, in terms of modern philosophers, is the most influential theorist, supporter of hedonism as a theory of value. And in this selection from Mill's writings that we have, he discusses this criticism of hedonism, this criticism to the effect that hedonism is a doctrine worthy only of swine. That's the way that the critics of hedonism would put it. Hedonism, as we said last time, was criticized on the grounds that to live for pleasure is unbecoming. It's undignified for a human being. Such a life, that is to say, a life devoted to pleasure, would be no better than that of an animal. So that's the criticism. We talked a little bit last time about Mill's reply to that criticism. And we go into it in a little bit more depth in this reading selection that we have today, this primary source, this selection from Mill's writings. And one thing that Mill says is that, that criticism supposes human beings are capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. But as we said last time in our discussion of hedonism, hedonism historically, going all the way back to Epicurus, and it continues to be the case with Mill, hedonism distinguishes different levels of pleasure. So this is an important qualification. Here again, we said last time that Epicurus, Mill, they attached the greatest value to pleasures of the mind, intellectual pleasures, the pleasures associated with creativity, what Mill sometimes calls the pleasures of the imagination, as well as social pleasures, the pleasures involved in family life, the great pleasure of friendship, the pleasure associated with being involved in your community, and being engaged in your community in a constructive way. All of those pleasures, of course, count far higher for Mill, for Epicurus, than physical pleasures. As we saw, both Epicurus and Mill gave relatively little value to sensual gratification, to physical pleasure. So Mill's reply to that criticism is basically that it rests on a misunderstanding. the critic seems to think that hedonism is saying that a life devoted to physical pleasure is the highest life. And then the criticism would be, well, here again, that would be no better than the life of an animal. Well, that's right. That's right. If the hedonists were saying that life ought to be devoted to the pursuit of physical pleasure, then that would be a fair criticism. But Mill's point is that that's not what hedonism is saying. That's a misunderstanding. That's a misconception about the theory of value. As we've seen, Epicurus and Mill did not attach great value to sensual gratification, to sensual pleasure. They attached far more value to the pleasures of the mind. So one way that Mill put the point was to say that, a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conceptions of happiness. Human beings have faculties, that is to say abilities or capacities. Human beings have faculties more elevated than animal appetites. And when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. So, if hedonism were saying that life ought to be devoted to the pursuit of sensual pleasure, physical pleasure, then yes, such a life would be of no more value than the life of a pig that gets to roll around in the mud all day. Let's suppose that that is the greatest pleasure for pigs. That's what makes them the happiest. I don't know that that's true, but let's just follow along the criticism and try to understand it on its own terms. That seems to be what the critic is saying when the critic of hedonism says that hedonism is a swinish philosophy. Well, if human beings were only capable of physical pleasure, then yes, there would be no difference between the best life for a pig and the best life for a human being. That's right. That would be a fair criticism, but it's not, according to Mill, because human beings are capable of these higher pleasures, these pleasures that are connected to the exercise of our higher faculties. Again, a pig does not have the capacity for intellectual pleasure. Pigs don't engage in math and science and literature and so forth. They don't exercise the imagination. They don't exercise the intellect. They don't paint or write novels or anything like that. So, yeah, their range of pleasures is more sharply limited than the pleasures that human beings are capable of experiencing. That's right. Human beings do have more elevated faculties, and a human being would not regard a life as a happy life, one that did not include intellectual pleasures, pleasures of the mind, pleasures of the imagination, the pleasures associated with exercising our creativity. What Mill is saying here is that a human being would not consider it a good life, would not consider it to be a good life if the life had none of those pleasures. That's why, of course, a human being, looking at another human being just rolling around in the mud all day because it feels good, would not regard that as a good life. So it's not really a fair criticism. Now, we will come next time to criticisms that are more philosophically substantive, more serious kinds of criticisms, but at least this initial criticism seems to be a rather superficial one. It seems to rest on a misunderstanding of what hedonism historically has been saying, both in the case of ancient thinkers like Epicurus and in the case of modern thinkers like John Stuart Mill. Mill wrote that hedonism assigns to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feeling and imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value as pleasures than to those of mere sensation. So Mill's hedonism recognizes what he called the superiority of mental over bodily pleasures. So again, if the view were that one ought to live for pleasure in the sense of sensual pleasure in the life of physical pleasure, then yes, that would be a fair criticism to say it's a philosophy only fit for pigs. It's a swinish philosophy. That would be a fair criticism, but it rests on, again, a misunderstanding of hedonism as a theory of value historically, going back to the ancients like Epicurus, and certainly that would be true with respect to Mill's version of hedonism as well. Pleasures of the intellect, here again, those would be the kinds of pleasures associated with employing your mind, using your mind to solve any kind of intellectual problem. A problem in math, or a problem in science, or a problem in logic. What he calls here pleasures of the feeling and imagination. What might he mean by that? Maybe by the feeling, learning to appreciate the depths of character, the complexity of a person's psychological makeup in the sense of reading a great novel, something like that. Pleasures of the imagination. Here again, being able to appreciate art, being able to think creatively. What he calls here pleasures of the moral sentiments. What might he mean by that? Well, learning to get pleasure from helping others, making the effort to be a more altruistic person, that is to say, a person focused more on helping others than putting oneself first. That's a kind of moral virtue, being an altruistic person, being a kind person, being a charitable person. All these moral virtues, of course, require some effort. We're probably naturally inclined to be more self-interested and more self-absorbed, more focused on our own interests. So it takes an effort for us as moral beings, takes an effort for us as human beings to cultivate moral virtues like kindness and generosity and charity and altruism. But of course, when one makes the effort, there's a lot of pleasure that is then associated with exercising, again, one of these higher faculties that we have. We do have this higher faculty, this capacity for moral action, for morally virtuous action, that of course animals don't have. And so here again, as Mill said a moment ago, nobody who has these higher capacities would think of a life devoted entirely to physical pleasure, just a life rolling around in the mud, say, for example. No one who has these higher faculties would see that as a truly pleasurable, a truly happy life. So again, that's Mill's point, is when he says, when hedonism historically has said, one ought to live for pleasure, here again he means the pleasures associated with the distinctively human, the higher, what he calls the higher faculties. Those all count for far more. Again, pleasures of intellect, of feeling, of imagination, of moral sentiments, those all count for much more as pleasures than physical pleasures, what he calls pleasures of mere sensation. So Mill's hedonism recognizes that the pleasures associated with the exercise of the intellect, with the exercise of our creativity, our imagination, here again, pleasures of feeling, maybe the ability to empathize with others, the ability to sympathize with others, the ability to cultivate an attachment to and a valuing of the well-being and promoting the interests of others. Again, these moral sentiments, all of those have more value as pleasures than pleasures of mere sensation. Here again, physical pleasures are fleeting. They're ephemeral. They're momentary. They don't last for very long. But the kind of pleasure that's associated with being able to appreciate a great work of literature, every time you come back to it, you get more out of it. It's a kind of pleasure that deepens with repetition, which isn't true really of a physical pleasure. It's pleasant for a moment, but then it passes. But pleasures associated with the intellect, with the imagination, those tend to become more intense with repetition. Mill said that some kinds of pleasures are more desirable and more valuable than others. So there's more pleasure to be had out of making the effort to appreciate a great work of literature, say, for example, than the pleasure that comes from reading a comic book, say, for example. As literature, say, for example, Shakespeare is better than comic books. Some pleasures are more valuable than others. That doesn't mean one can't also get pleasure from comic books, of course. but the pleasure associated with reading a comic book requires less effort, obviously, than being able to derive pleasure from a great work of literature, say, for example, Shakespeare. That requires more effort. You have to look up the words that you don't know. You have to understand something of the genre. You have to understand something of the history surrounding it. You have to make the effort to understand the conventions of poetic expression, poetic meter, and so forth. All those things take time to learn, and so to appreciate Shakespeare is obviously not as easy as to appreciate comic books. But when one makes the effort, the kind of pleasure derived from the ability to appreciate great literature, say for example, is more valuable than other kinds of pleasures. So some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. Now when he says here more desirable, what he means is that, say for example, just to stick with my example of as literature, Shakespeare is better than comic books. The works of Shakespeare have more intrinsic value than comic books have. They're more desirable in that sense. By desirable here, does he mean more people desire to have this experience? No. More people desire to appreciate, to eat candy bars than to cultivate an appreciation for classical music, say for example. More people desire to read a comic book than to read Shakespeare, say for example. So not desirable, so some pleasures, Mill says here, some pleasures are more desirable than others, not in the sense of more people desire X than desire Y, but it may be the case that there's more intrinsic value in Y than there is in X, and if one makes the effort, if one makes the effort to be able to appreciate that higher source of pleasure, that higher source of aesthetic value, in the case of a work of art or great music or great literature, then there is more, it's more desirable in the sense that there is more value to get out of it. So pleasures of the intellect and imagination, Mill observes, they engage our higher faculties. Thus, they are higher in quality than sensual pleasures. The faculties involved with bodily pleasures are those we share with animals. Pleasures that engage distinctively human faculties are the distinctively human, and thus the higher pleasures. So it's an interesting question, isn't it? Why is it the case that intellectual pleasures are better than bodily pleasures? One reason would be this reason that I touched on a moment ago. Intellectual pleasures deepen, they become more intense with repetition in a way that isn't true of bodily pleasures. The pleasure associated with eating a candy bar, say for example, is brief. It doesn't last very long, does it? It's fleeting. Take for example some pleasant sensation like running your hand over a piece of silk, say for example. That's a very pleasant sensation. But you wouldn't want to sit and do it all day long, would you? I mean, that would get old pretty fast. On the other hand, the pleasure associated with being able to appreciate a great work of music or a great work of literature, right, that becomes more intense with repetition. A great work of literature, every time you come back to it, you see something in it, you find something in it that you hadn't noticed before, that contributes to the meaning, that contributes to the literary effect, the literary value. You notice something in a really well-made movie, a really well-written novel, something like that. Great music. You notice a little detail every time what makes them great, what makes the classics is every time you come back to them, there's more to get out of them in a way that you just can't say with respect to comic books, or here again with respect to some merely sensual pleasure, like stroking a piece of silk, say for example. Those pleasures don't intensify with repetition, but the pleasure associated with engaging your mind, those kinds of pleasures do deepen. They do become more intense with repetition. And so I suppose that's one reason why intellectual pleasures are better than bodily pleasures. So what makes one pleasure more valuable than another? Well, Mill's an empiricist. This is a broad kind of position in the branch of knowledge, the branch of philosophy that deals with the issue of knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? There are different philosophical answers to that question. One tradition in philosophy, more specifically this branch of philosophy that deals with the nature and sources of knowledge, this branch of philosophy is called epistemology. One long-standing tradition, one old tradition in epistemology would be the empiricist position that knowledge comes from experience. And Mill is an empiricist. That was characteristic of 19th century British philosophy. In fact, that was characteristic of British philosophy going back some time before that. There's always been a strong emphasis, a strong current of empiricism in modern British philosophy. And Mill is in that tradition. He believes that experience is the source of all knowledge. So what makes one pleasure more valuable than another? Well, Mill would say we know that on the basis of experience. But now, on the basis of whose experience? Well, somebody to make that judgment, to make the judgment that X is a better pleasure than Y, has to be in a position to appreciate both. So experience is ultimately what determines whether one pleasure is better than another. But here again, it's the experience of qualified judges or competent judges, people who are competent to make that judgment because they can appreciate both X and Y. So experience in the sense of the testimony of those who have experience of both. Mill is an empiricist. He believes that experience is the source of all knowledge, and he regards it as a well-established fact that those who have experience of both higher and lower pleasures, they always attach more value to the higher pleasures. So you have to, when you're trying to make this determination, which pleasure is the more valuable pleasure, which pleasure is the better pleasure between two pleasures, between X and Y, let's say. If you ask somebody who can only appreciate X or can only appreciate Y, of course, they're not in a position to make that judgment. You have to seek out the testimony, you have to seek out the experience of those who are capable of appreciating both. So I, for example, can appreciate both great literature like Shakespeare, and I appreciate comic books as well. Or at least I did more when I was a kid. I don't know if they're so common today as they were when I was a kid, but comic books have their value, and in some cases they have a lot of value when you get up to the upper tiers of them, like graphic novels and so forth. Some of them have an awful lot of aesthetic value. So I can appreciate the value of comic books. Now, I can also appreciate the value of Shakespeare, and I agree with Mill. I'm in a position to appreciate both. I do appreciate both, and I agree with Mill that the one. This is not Mill's example actually, but it's just my example. I would agree with those who would say that as literature, Shakespeare is more valuable than comic books, because although it requires more time and effort to learn to appreciate Shakespeare, I would say that here again, every time you come back to one of Shakespeare's great comedies or tragedies, there is more depth to the characters. There is more complexity to the story. There is more to be learned about human nature from Shakespeare than there is from comic books. So I appreciate both. I see value in both. I would say that Shakespeare as literature, here again, maybe not looking all the time just to have a rich literary experience. Sometimes you're not, but just comparing the two as literature, Shakespeare is more valuable than comic books. Here again, somebody who can't appreciate comic books is not in a position to make that judgment. And someone who is not in a position to appreciate Shakespeare is not in a position to make that judgment either. You have to seek out the testimony. You have to consult the experience of those who can appreciate both. And Mill thinks that when you do that, here again, to move the point to the broader philosophical issue now, He takes it as a well-established fact that those who have experience of both what he calls the higher and the lower pleasures, they always attach greater value to the higher pleasures. If you ask someone who can only appreciate physical pleasures, then of course that person is not competent to judge which of the two is the more valuable pleasure. But people who can appreciate both, people who can appreciate sensual pleasures, physical pleasures, and who also appreciate the pleasures associated with exercising the mind, the intellectual pleasures, the pleasures associated with imagination and creativity, and here again, moral sentiments and feeling. Virtually everyone who can appreciate both would agree that those pleasures that exercise our higher faculties are the more valuable, the deeper, the more lasting, the more intrinsically valuable pleasures.